He refused. The command had already been given, sharp and final, cutting through the cold afternoon air like a blade that didn't expect to be questioned. Red and blue lights flickered against storefront glass, stretching long shadows across the sidewalk where people had gathered in uneasy silence. Officer Daniel Hayes stood rigid, one hand gripping the leash, the other hovering near his radio, his breath steady but shallow as if something in his chest had tightened without permission. Beside him, Rex, a full-grown German shepherd with a sable coat darkened along the spine, leaned forward just enough to feel the tension in the line, ears upright, eyes locked ahead with a focus that had never failed him before. 20 feet away stood an old man, thin shoulders wrapped in a worn coat that had seen too many winters, his hands trembling not from fear alone but from something deeper, something that clung to him like dust that never washed off. The man didn't run. He didn't argue. He simply stood there, as if he had already accepted whatever came next. The crowd whispered, shifting weight from foot to foot, the low murmur of judgment rising and falling like distant traffic. Somewhere, a car door slammed. Somewhere else, a siren faded into nothing. "Release the dog," came the voice again through Hayes' earpiece, colder this time, less patient. Hayes swallowed, his grip tightening instinctively, his training echoing in his mind. Commands are followed, hesitation costs time, time changes outcomes. He had done this before. Dozens of times. Maybe more. And every time, Rex had responded without question, a perfect extension of discipline and trust. Hayes leaned slightly forward, voice low, controlled. "Rex, go." The leash loosened. For a fraction of a second, everything moved exactly as it should. Rex stepped forward, muscles coiled, paws silent against the pavement. The distance closed, 15 feet, then 10. The old man closed his eyes, chin dipping just enough to suggest surrender rather than fear. The world seemed to narrow, sound thinning until all that remained was the rhythm of breath and the soft scrape of a paw against concrete. 5 feet. 4. 3. And then nothing. Rex stopped. Not slowed. Not hesitated. Stopped. His body froze in place as if the ground itself had told him to hold. His ears twitched once. His chest rose and fell. But he did not move forward. Hayes felt it instantly, a strange emptiness in the leash where tension should have been. "Rex," he said, quieter now, almost unsure of his own voice. The dog didn't respond. Instead, his head shifted slightly, eyes narrowing, attention drifting, not away in distraction, but redirecting with purpose. A low sound formed in his throat, not a bark, not a warning, but something deeper, something older. Hayes followed the line of Rex's gaze, his heartbeat picking up in a way that had nothing to do with the situation in front of him. The old man remained still, untouched, almost forgotten in the moment. Behind him, just beyond the edge of the crowd, a man in a pressed jacket stood too still, his posture tight, his hands buried deep in his pockets despite the mild chill. Rex's body angled, just slightly, but enough. Enough to change everything. Hayes felt it then, not fear, not confusion, but the quiet, unsettling realization that something had shifted, something no command could override. And for the first time since he'd clipped that leash to Rex's collar, he didn't feel like the one in control. The silence did not break all at once, it cracked slowly, like ice under weight, as the murmur of the crowd shifted from certainty to confusion, a ripple of doubt spreading through eyes that had already decided what they were looking at. Officer Hayes felt the radio at his shoulder buzz again, sharper this time, the voice on the other end losing its patience. "Hayes, what is the delay?" It said, each word clipped, controlled, but edged with warning. Hayes did not answer right away. His gaze stayed fixed on Rex, on the subtle tension in the dog's stance, the way his muscles were not coiled to spring forward but held in a different kind of readiness, something quieter, more deliberate. This was not disobedience. This was decision. Hayes had seen Rex track scents across miles of open terrain, had watched him identify threats hidden beneath layers of deception, had trusted him in moments where hesitation meant failure. And now, standing in the middle of a city street with sirens still echoing faintly in the distance, Hayes felt that same instinct rise again, not in the dog, but in himself. "Rex," he said, softer now, not a command, but a question. The dog's ears flicked once, acknowledging, but his eyes never left that point beyond the old man, beyond the scene everyone else was focused on. The old man shifted slightly, just enough to pull a breath through dry lips, his shoulders sagging with a quiet exhaustion that did not match the accusation hanging over him. He did not run. He did not plead. He simply waited, as though he had lived long enough to know that sometimes truth arrives too late to matter. Hayes felt something tighten in his chest at that, something he could not name, something that did not belong in procedure manuals or training drills. The voice on the radio came again, louder now, more insistent. "Release the dog, officer. That is a direct order." Hayes exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cooling air, and for a moment he closed his eyes, not to escape the moment, but to steady himself inside it. When he opened them again, he did not look at the old man. He followed Rex's gaze. There, just past the edge of the crowd, stood the man in the press jacket, his posture too rigid, his stillness unnatural against the shifting bodies around him. A drop of sweat traced along his temple despite the mild temperature, catching the flashing lights in brief glints. His hands remained buried in his pockets, but his shoulders had drawn inward, protective, guarded. Hayes took one slow step forward, the leash still loose in his hand, and Rex moved with him, not ahead, not behind, but beside, as if they were aligned in something unspoken. The crowd parted slightly without realizing it, creating a narrow path that had not existed seconds before. The old man remained behind them now, untouched, no longer the center of attention, though he had been only moments ago. Hayes felt the shift as clearly as the weight of the badge on his chest. Whatever this was, it was no longer about the command he had been given. It was about something else. Something Rex had already understood. And Hayes was just beginning to see. The distance between them closed slowly, not with urgency, but with a kind of gravity that pulled everything into a quieter focus, as if the world itself had decided to hold its breath and wait. Officer Hayes could feel it in the way the air pressed against his skin, in the subtle shift of the crowd as people leaned back instead of forward, uncertainty replacing the confidence they had carried only moments ago. Rex moved in perfect sync beside him, his gait measured, controlled, each step placed with intention rather than impulse, his eyes never wavering from the man in the press jacket. The man noticed now. It was small at first, just a flicker, a tightening at the corners of his mouth, but it was enough. His shoulders lifted slightly, then settled again as if he were trying to convince himself that nothing had changed. But everything had. Hayes stopped a few feet away, close enough to see the fine details now, the faint sheen of perspiration along the man's forehead, the way his jaw clenched and unclenched without sound, the subtle shift of weight from one foot to the other that spoke louder than any words could. "Sir," Hayes said, his voice calm, steady, but carrying a weight that drew attention without force. "I am going to need you to take your hands out of your pockets." The man blinked, once, then again, as if processing the request took more effort than it should. Around them, the flashing lights painted everything in alternating shades of red and blue, stretching shadows across faces that had begun to turn, curiosity pulling their focus away from the old man behind them. Rex's posture lowered slightly, not in aggression, but in readiness, his tail still, his breath slow and controlled, a low vibration forming deep in his chest, not loud enough to startle, but impossible to ignore once heard. The man hesitated. It was brief, barely more than a heartbeat, but Hayes saw it, and Rex felt it. "I did not do anything," the man said, his voice measured but thinner than before, as though something beneath it had begun to crack. Hayes did not respond immediately. He watched. He listened. Not just to the words, but to everything around them, the rhythm of breath, the tension in shoulders, the silence where there should have been ease. "I understand," Hayes replied finally, his tone even, almost gentle. "But I still need to see your hands." Another pause. Longer this time. The man's gaze flicked briefly to the side, searching, calculating, then returned to Hayes, but the stillness was gone now, replaced by something more fragile. Slowly, reluctantly, his hands began to emerge from his pockets, fingers stiff, movements controlled but lacking the natural ease of someone with nothing to hide. Rex took one small step forward, just enough to close the final inches between instinct and certainty, his nose lifting slightly as if catching something carried on the air that no one else could sense. Hayes felt the shift again, stronger now, clearer. This was not confusion. This was confirmation. Behind them, the old man remained where he had been, unnoticed now, his presence fading into the background as the truth, quiet and patient, began to step forward in his place. Hayes did not look back. He did not need to. Whatever had brought them here had already changed direction. And Rex had known it before anyone else. The man's hands came into the light slowly, fingers slightly curled, as if even the act of revealing them required a decision he was not ready to make, and in that small hesitation something invisible shifted again, something that did not need words to be understood. Officer Hayes watched carefully, not just the movement itself, but the space around it, the tension that lingered in the man's shoulders, the way his breath came just a fraction too fast for someone claiming calm. Rex remained still, but the energy in him changed, subtle but unmistakable, like a compass locking onto true north, his focus unwavering, his body aligned not with command, but with certainty. The low sound in his chest deepened slightly, still controlled, still restrained, but now carrying a quiet insistence that seemed to press against the air itself. "Easy," Hayes murmured, though he was no longer sure whether he was speaking to the man or to the dog or perhaps to himself. The crowd had grown quieter now, the earlier whispers replaced by a heavier silence, the kind that comes when people begin to realize they might have been wrong. A woman near the front shifted her stance, lowering her phone without noticing, her expression tightening as her gaze moved from the old man to the man in the jacket. Somewhere behind, a car engine idled, its steady hum filling the gaps where certainty used to be. "Place your hands where I can see them," Hayes continued, his voice calm but firmer now, grounded in something deeper than protocol. The man complied, but the motion lacked ease, his wrists stiff, his fingers spreading too slowly, as though each inch of movement revealed more than he intended. Rex stepped forward again, closing the space to just a few feet, his nose lifting slightly, drawing in the air with quiet precision, and for a brief moment his head tilted, not in confusion, but in recognition. Hayes had seen that before. Not often. Only when Rex found something that did not belong where it should not be. The man noticed the shift. His eyes flickered downward, then back up, then away again, searching for something that was no longer there, some sense of control that had quietly slipped from his grasp. "I told you I did nothing," he said again, but the words felt thinner now, less anchored, as if they could not hold their own weight. Hayes did not respond immediately. Instead, he let the silence stretch, just long enough for the truth to press against it. "Then you have nothing to worry about," Hayes said finally, his tone steady, almost reassuring, though his gaze remained sharp. Rex's posture lowered another inch, not threatening, not aggressive, but ready, his attention fixed with a clarity that left no room for doubt. Behind them, the old man shifted slightly, his eyes opening now, confusion replacing resignation as he watched the focus move away from him, his place in the moment quietly dissolving. He took a small step back, unnoticed by most, but Hayes caught it in the edge of his vision, a reminder of how quickly judgment can land and how slowly it lifts. The man in the jacket swallowed the movement, visible in his throat, his composure thinning with each passing second. A faint scent carried on the air, something metallic, something out of place, and though Hayes could not identify it, Rex already had. The dog's ears sharpened forward, his body aligning with a single, undeniable point of focus. Hayes felt it then, clear and undeniable, a shift not just in the situation, but in understanding itself. This was no longer a question of compliance. It was a question of truth. And standing there under the flickering lights, with the weight of expectation pressing from every direction, Hayes realized that the only one who had never wavered from that truth was the one who had never spoken a word. The air seemed to grow heavier with each passing second, as if the truth itself carried weight, pressing down on everyone present, bending certainty into something uncertain and fragile. Officer Hayes did not move right away. He stood there, steady, grounded, but inside something had already shifted beyond return. Rex was no longer just responding. He was leading. The dog took one deliberate step closer, closing the final distance with quiet authority, his nose lifting again, drawing in the scent that no one else could detect, his focus narrowing until the rest of the world seemed to fall away. The man in the jacket felt it. That much was clear. His shoulders tightened further, his chest rising faster now, each breath shallow, controlled, but failing to keep pace with the tension building beneath his composure. "Stay where you are," Hayes said, his voice calm but now unmistakably firm, the kind of tone that did not invite negotiation. The man nodded quickly, too quickly, his eyes flicking once more toward the edges of the crowd, as if searching for an exit that no longer existed. Behind them, the flashing lights continued their steady rhythm, painting the scene in pulses of red and blue, each wave revealing more than the last. Rex's head lowered slightly, his gaze locked, his body aligned in a way Hayes had learned to trust long before this moment. There was no aggression in it. No chaos. Only clarity. "Sir?" Hayes continued, taking a slow step forward, the leash still loose in his hand. "I need you to step forward, slowly." The man hesitated again, longer this time, and that hesitation spoke louder than any denial. Around them, the crowd leaned in, not out of curiosity now, but out of something closer to realization. The narrative they had formed was unraveling, thread by thread, replaced by something far less certain. The man took a step forward, then another, his movements careful, measured, but lacking the natural rhythm of someone at ease. Rex moved with him, matching each step, his nose now close enough to catch the source of the scent fully, his body tensing not in reaction, but in confirmation. Hayes felt it too, not through smell, but through instinct, the same instinct that had guided him in moments where logic alone was not enough. "That is close enough," Hayes said, raising his hand slightly. The man stopped. His hands remained visible now, but they trembled faintly, the control he had tried to maintain slipping in small, undeniable ways. A faint metallic scent lingered in the air between them, something out of place, something that did not belong to the old man who still stood behind, forgotten but watching, his confusion deepening with every passing moment. Hayes glanced back briefly, just for a second, and saw the old man's eyes, not angry, not afraid, but tired, as if he had seen this kind of moment before, where judgment arrives faster than truth. Hayes turned back. Rex did not. The dog remained locked on the man in front of them, his low, steady vibration continuing, a quiet signal that something hidden was now fully exposed. "I am going to ask you one more time," Hayes said, his voice even, but carrying a new weight. "Is there anything you need to tell me before we go further?" The man's lips parted slightly, but no words came. His gaze dropped, just for a fraction of a second, toward the inside of his jacket, then lifted again too quickly, as if hoping no one had noticed. But Rex had. And Hayes had learned never to ignore what Rex saw. The silence stretched again, longer now, heavier, until it felt like the entire street was waiting for something to break. Hayes did not raise his voice. He did not repeat the command. Instead, he simply stood there, beside the one partner who had never failed him, and allowed the truth to surface on its own. Because sometimes, the loudest moment is not when something happens. It is when something hidden can no longer stay hidden. The moment stretched thin, like a wire pulled to its limit, and in that fragile silence something unseen finally gave way, not with noise, not with force, but with the quiet certainty of truth surfacing where it had been buried too long. Officer Hayes did not rush it. He had learned that forcing a moment often broke it, and this one needed no help. Rex stood perfectly still, his entire body aligned with a single point of focus, his breathing slow, controlled, as if even he understood that what came next mattered more than anything that had led up to it. The man in the jacket shifted again, a subtle movement at first, a tightening of his shoulders, a slight turn of his torso as though he might step back, but he did not. He could not. The space around him had closed in, not physically, but in awareness, in the weight of eyes that had begun to see something different. Hayes watched carefully, his gaze steady, his posture calm but unyielding. "Go ahead," he said quietly, not a command, not a threat, just an opening. The man swallowed, his throat moving visibly, his eyes darting once more, searching for an anchor that was no longer there. Then, slowly, almost reluctantly, his right hand moved toward the inside of his jacket. The crowd leaned in again, but this time there was no rush of judgment, only a collective stillness, as if everyone understood that whatever happened next would redefine everything that had come before. Rex's ears sharpened forward, his body lowering just slightly, not in aggression, but in readiness, his focus absolute. Hayes did not move to stop the man. He did not raise his voice. He simply watched, trusting the moment, trusting the partner beside him. The man's hand slipped inside the jacket, fingers fumbling briefly before finding something hidden, something small, something that had been kept out of sight until now. When his hand emerged again, it held a folded object, dark, compact, and unmistakably out of place in a situation that had been framed so differently only minutes ago. The man hesitated, looking at it as if seeing it clearly for the first time, then slowly extended it forward, his arm trembling slightly as the weight of what he carried became more than just physical. Hayes stepped closer, just enough to take the object, his movements careful, deliberate, his eyes never leaving the man's face for long. As he unfolded it, the truth began to take shape, not in dramatic revelation, but in quiet confirmation, in details that aligned too precisely to be coincidence. Behind them, the old man took another small step back, his shoulders lowering, a breath leaving him that seemed to have been held for far too long. The crowd shifted again, but this time the movement was different, softer, as realization replaced assumption. Hayes looked up, meeting the man's eyes, and for a moment there was no accusation in his gaze, only understanding, the kind that comes when a story changes direction and leaves no room for denial. Rex exhaled slowly, the low vibration in his chest fading, his posture easing just enough to signal that the answer had been found. Hayes did not speak right away. He did not need to. The truth was already there, held in his hand, reflected in the silence around them. And in that silence, one thing became clear beyond question. The moment that had begun with a command had ended with something far stronger. Trust. Not in orders. Not in appearances. But in the quiet, unwavering instinct of a partner who had never once been wrong. For a few seconds, no one moved, not even the wind seemed to pass through the street, as if the entire world had paused to acknowledge what had just been revealed. Officer Hayes held the unfolded object in his hand, his eyes scanning it once more, slower this time, letting each detail settle into place with quiet certainty. It was not just what the object was, but what it meant, how it connected, how it contradicted everything that had been assumed minutes earlier. He exhaled softly, the kind of breath that carried both relief and weight, then lifted his gaze back to the man in the jacket. The man no longer tried to hold his posture. The stiffness had faded, replaced by something looser, not calm, but resigned, as if the effort to maintain control had finally slipped beyond reach. "You want to explain this?" Hayes said, his voice even, not accusing, not raised, but grounded in the kind of authority that did not need force. The man hesitated, his lips parting slightly, then closing again, his eyes dropping to the pavement before lifting once more, but this time there was no deflection left, no angle to escape through. "It is not what it looks like," he said quietly, though the words carried no conviction, only habit. Hayes did not interrupt. He had heard that line before, in many forms, in many situations, and it never meant what it claimed. Instead, he let the silence sit between them again, not as pressure, but as space, the kind that invites truth to step forward if it is willing. Behind him, Rex shifted slightly, his posture easing now, the low vibration in his chest gone, replaced by a calm stillness that signaled the work was done. The dog's eyes remained alert, but no longer searching, as if the answer he had been holding on to had already been handed over. Hayes nodded once, a small motion, almost to himself, then turned his body slightly, angling just enough for the others to see what he held. The reaction was immediate, though not loud. A quiet wave passed through the crowd, a collective intake of breath, the kind that does not need words to carry meaning. Faces changed. Expressions softened. Some looked away, others leaned closer, but no one spoke. The story had shifted, and everyone felt it. Hayes stepped back half a pace, creating space again, but this time not between himself and the man, but between assumption and reality. "Turn around," he said calmly. The man did not resist. He did not argue. He simply complied slowly, his movements deliberate, as though each action was no longer his own, but guided by something inevitable. Hayes moved with practiced precision, careful, controlled, ensuring everything remained steady, measured, without escalation, without unnecessary force. Rex stayed beside him, quiet, watchful, no longer needing to intervene, his presence alone enough to hold the moment in place. As it settled, as the tension finally began to release its grip on the air, Hayes glanced briefly over his shoulder. The old man still stood there, but now he looked different. Not because he had changed, but because the weight that had been placed on him had begun to lift. His shoulders were no longer drawn as tightly, his gaze no longer fixed on the ground. Instead, he looked up, meeting Hayes' eyes for a brief second, and in that look there was no anger, no demand, just a quiet acknowledgement, the kind that passes between people who understand something without needing to say it. Hayes held that look for a moment, then gave the smallest nod before turning back. Around them, the lights still flashed, the city still moved, but something in the scene had settled into a different rhythm, one that felt steadier, clearer. And standing there, with Rex at his side, Hayes understood something he would not forget. Orders can guide action. But trust, real trust, the kind built in silence and proven in moments like this, can change direction entirely. And sometimes, the one who leads you to the truth is the one who never needed to speak at all. The scene did not erupt into chaos, as some might expect. There was no sudden rush of voices or movement, only a slow, almost reverent shift in the atmosphere, as if everyone present understood they had just witnessed something that could not be undone. Officer Hayes remained steady, his hand resting lightly near the man he had just secured, not as a show of force, but as a quiet anchor to the moment, ensuring it stayed grounded in calm rather than reaction. The flashing lights continued to wash over the street, but they felt different now, less urgent, less accusatory, their rhythm settling into something almost distant. Rex stood beside Hayes, no longer tense, his posture relaxed yet alert, the kind of stillness that comes after a task has been completed exactly as it should be. His eyes moved once, briefly, toward the old man behind them, then back again, as if confirming what had already become clear. Hayes followed that glance. The old man had not moved far, but the difference in him was unmistakable. The weight that had once pressed his shoulders down had lifted, replaced by a cautious, almost fragile steadiness. His hands, which had trembled before, now rested at his sides, not rigid, not clenched, just present. He looked smaller now, not in stature, but in the way the world had momentarily stepped away from him, leaving him standing quietly in its wake. Hayes took a slow breath, then turned fully toward him, taking a few measured steps across the pavement. The distance between them felt longer than it was, stretched by everything that had just occurred. When Hayes stopped, he did not reach for his radio, did not call out, did not explain. Instead, he simply stood there, meeting the old man's eyes with a calm that carried more meaning than words could hold. "Sir," he said finally, his voice low, steady, "you are not in any trouble." The words hung in the air, simple, direct, but heavy with everything they corrected. The old man blinked once, as if the sentence took time to settle, as if it had to pass through layers of doubt before it could be believed. "I told them," the old man said softly, his voice rough with age and something deeper. "I told them I did not take anything." Hayes nodded, not in agreement, not in correction, but in acknowledgement. "I know," he replied, and this time the words were not procedural, they were personal. Behind them, the crowd began to shift again, but the energy had changed completely. People stepped back, some lowering their gaze, others exchanging quiet looks that spoke of reflection rather than curiosity. The earlier certainty had dissolved, replaced by something more human, more uncertain, but also more honest. Hayes turned slightly, glancing back at Rex. The dog stood exactly where he had been, watching, waiting, his presence steady, unwavering. Hayes walked back to him, stopping just close enough to rest his hand briefly against the thick fur at the back of Rex's neck. It was not a command. Not praise. Just contact. Rex did not move, but his ears softened slightly, his posture easing further, as if he understood the moment had shifted from action to meaning. Hayes looked down at him for a second, longer than necessary, then exhaled quietly. There were no words exchanged, none needed. The understanding between them had already been proven. Somewhere in the distance, another siren echoed faintly, a reminder that the world continued beyond this moment, beyond this street, beyond this quiet correction of something that could have gone very differently. Hayes straightened, his gaze lifting once more to the scene around him, now calmer, clearer, settled in a way that felt earned rather than restored. And in that stillness, one truth remained, simple and unshakable. Sometimes the difference between harm and grace is not found in the order given, but in the courage to pause long enough to listen to something deeper. The last of the tension did not disappear all at once, it unraveled slowly, like a knot that had been pulled too tight for too long, each thread loosening in quiet surrender to what had already been revealed. Officer Hayes stood there for a moment longer, not because he needed to, but because something in him understood that moments like this did not end with movement, they ended with stillness. The man in the jacket had been led away, not with force, not with spectacle, but with a quiet inevitability that left no room for resistance, his earlier certainty replaced by a silence that followed him like a shadow. The flashing lights began to dim as additional units repositioned, their urgency fading into routine, the scene no longer a crisis, but a resolution. Rex shifted his weight slightly, the first real movement he had made since everything had settled, his tail lowering into a relaxed line, his ears easing back just enough to signal that the work, the real work, was over. Hayes felt it through the leash, that subtle change, that quiet release, and it mirrored something inside him he had not yet put into words. He reached down again, his hand resting briefly against Rex's neck, fingers pressing gently into the thick fur, grounding himself in the presence that had guided him through the uncertainty. The dog did not look up, did not seek acknowledgement, he simply stood, steady and calm, as if what had happened was not extraordinary, but expected. Hayes exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cool air, and for the first time since the moment began, his shoulders dropped, just slightly, the tension leaving him in a way that felt deeper than physical. Behind him, the old man had taken a few tentative steps toward the edge of the sidewalk, not fleeing, not retreating, but simply moving as though he were re-entering a world that had briefly forgotten him. Hayes turned once more, closing the small distance between them, his pace unhurried, his posture open. The old man looked at him again, his eyes clearer now, though still carrying the weight of years that had taught him not to expect fairness. "Thank you," the old man said, his voice quiet, almost uncertain, as if he was not sure the words were his to give. Hayes paused, the statement settling between them, and for a moment he did not respond. Not because he did not have words, but because he understood that this was not about what was said. It was about what had not happened. Finally, he gave a small nod, the kind that carried more meaning than explanation ever could. "You are all right," he said, his tone steady, simple, and the old man seemed to take that in more than anything else, his shoulders easing further, his stance finding a fragile balance that had been missing before. The crowd had thinned now, people drifting away in quiet clusters, their voices low, their steps slower than before, as if each person carried a piece of the moment with them, something to consider, something to remember. No one clapped. No one cheered. It was not that kind of ending. It was quieter than that, more honest. Hayes turned back toward the street, his gaze sweeping over the scene that was returning to normal in small, gradual ways, officers speaking in measured tones, radios crackling softly, the rhythm of the city resuming its steady pulse. He adjusted his grip on the leash, though it remained loose, almost symbolic now, a connection rather than a control. Rex walked beside him as they began to move, not leading, not following, but matching his pace exactly, step for step, as they had done countless times before. There was no need for commands. There was no need for correction. The understanding between them had already been spoken in a language deeper than words. As they reached the edge of the scene, Hayes slowed, just for a moment, his gaze drifting forward but his thoughts settling behind him, replaying the moment when everything could have gone differently, when a single action could have followed a single order without question. He thought about the training, the discipline, the expectation to act without hesitation. And then he thought about the pause. The one moment where instinct rose above instruction, where trust interrupted certainty, where a dog chose not to act, and in doing so, revealed everything. Hayes glanced down at Rex again, just briefly, and this time there was a faint shift in his expression, something softer, something almost grateful. Rex's ears flicked once in response, not turning his head, not breaking stride, but acknowledging in the quiet way he always had. The sky above had begun to dim slightly, the late afternoon light softening into evening, casting longer shadows across the pavement, stretching the shapes of everything into something more reflective, more subdued. And in that fading light, as the noise of the moment dissolved into the background, one truth remained, steady and unspoken. Not every command deserves obedience. Not every assumption deserves belief. And sometimes, the clearest path to what is right comes not from the voice that speaks the loudest, but from the one that listens the closest.